everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today in the midst of this tragic war unfolding in Israel and Gaza. I'm Rabbi Lev Marowitz-Nelson. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the Director of Leadership and Learning here at Torah. Today, we're bringing you a conversation that might turn out to be the first part in a series. It's co-presented by Torah and our Emor Institute. Torah, a human rights organization representing over 2,300 rabbis and cantors in North America, is where most of our organization's response to the war is housed, including our response to events as they occur, and organizing and supporting rabbis and cantors to be a public moral voice. The part of this webinar that feels more like Emor is how we're stepping back from the news cycle and the urgency of the headlines to consider the situation through the lenses of Jewish text and ethics. Emor is here to ask big questions and bring as many people as possible into the conversation. And to that end, I'm grateful you've taken an hour out of your day to join us. Because many of us are feeling raw and emotions are running high, we've decided to disable the public chat for today. Our emotions matter. They're part of what make us human. So I make no judgment on any reactions we might have. But there are too many ways a chat can be misunderstood or fired off hastily. So we wanted to make sure everyone is safe. Please do use the chat to send questions to the meeting co-hosts. And at the appropriate time, I'll collect those and put them to our guest teacher. And I apologize in advance if I'm not able to get to your question. This webinar is being recorded. Closed captioning is available, so select that option in Zoom if you need it. And if you have other access needs, please put those in the chat and we'll do what we can to help. I just want to say a few words about why today's webinar is happening, and then I'll introduce our guest teacher. This was born out of a conversation among the Torah staff who are managing our response to the war. We had a strong feeling among ourselves of uncertainty, not knowing what Israel should do next, of facing a really awful set of choices with no obvious right path forward. We have more clarity about the wrong thing to do, which is only helpful up to a point. And we see too many actors in Israel and in the North American Jewish community rushing ahead as if it's perfectly clear to them. We wanted a venue to lift up humility as a virtue and the value of sitting in the discomfort of not knowing. Now, that makes for a bad statement headline. Rabbinic organization says it doesn't know what to do next. But it makes for great conversation and Torah study. So in that light, I'm very happy to have a rising star of the Torah study world here with us today, Rabbi Avigayil Halpern. Avigayil was ordained this past June at the Hadar Institute, but has been teaching Torah, building community, and writing for over 10 years. In 2021, she was recognized as one of New York Jewish Week's 36 under 36, and she is a Vatichtov She Writes Fellow. Closest to home for us, Avigayil has an essay in the second issue of Fragments, Emor's flagship publication, which will be published later this winter. Avigayil, thank you for being here. We are excited to learn your Torah for this moment.
Thank you so much for having me. It feels so nourishing to get to be here in this Zoom full of people who want to take time to sit with some Torah right now. Okay, I'm going to give you all an introduction to what we're about to do. But first, I want you to just take a minute. And we learn Torah with our bodies and not just our minds. So take a minute, feel how you're sitting. Do one thing to sit a little more comfortably. Do you need a sip of water? Do you need a bathroom break? I don't know about you all, but I've found it very hard to notice what my body needs lately. Let's take a breath. So when Lev emailed me, I was like, I definitely want to teach, and I have no idea what it is that feels like the Torah. Even I always try to start from the question of what Torah do I need, because I can at least then identify one person's need and go from there. And I was thinking so much about how what's feeling so hard is the ways that we're looking at how conversations and debates and just the impact of our words can be so impactful on real life structures of power, of violence, of grief, of loss. And in thinking about what text actually speaks to that, I found myself really drawn to this very well-known story, which if you don't know it, you're about to, of the oven of Achnai, which is from Tractate Bava Metzia. It's a Talmudic story where the kind of most well-known, famous piece of it is the rabbis saying, God doesn't determine what the Torah is. We, the human beings, have the power to determine what Torah is. And that might be the climax of the story, but that's actually only the halfway point of the whole story. And we're going to look at this story together, and we're going to then we're going to go through together. We're going to look at each section, and then we're going to look at an interpretation from Dr. Rebecca Epstein-Levy, who is an ethicist and a Talmudist at Vanderbilt, who analyzes this story in her recent book, and which I thought was a very helpful way of thinking about what can we do as people who, for whatever reason, registered for a webinar about Torah right now? And what's the purpose of Torah learning? How can Torah, not just in content, but as a practice, be something that's helping move us towards a better world, even when we're facing crisis and trauma and grief? So we're going to speed through the first half of the story and then focus more on the second half. Victoria, can we share the source sheet? Thank you. Okay. So I would actually love a volunteer to read. I'm going to have a volunteer read each section so you don't just listen to my voice the whole time.
So use the raise hand feature to volunteer, and then we can unmute you.
Thank you. Reba, thank you so much for volunteering. And if you volunteer to read, I might at some points interrupt you to clarify what's going on. And an important thing to know about this particular translation we're working with, it's from Sefaria via Koran. And the way they do their translations is the bolded pieces are the direct translation, and the not bold pieces are the interpretive interpolations, so that the very dense language makes more sense to us. So the bold does not mean this is more important. It just means this is the more direct translation part.
Okay, Reba, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you zoom it in? Make it bigger?
We can sure try.
We absolutely are going to try. I have total confidence.
I've got it the biggest I can on my screen.
Yeah, we are on it. Give it just one
I was gonna say, I am trying to see if I can zoom it in any further. Give me 1 second. Apologies.
I can also just make
Unless
the
you can
text
put it
bigger.
as a document in the chat.
Yeah, let me drop it in the chat if that's a bit easier. I don't think I
Chat,
can
and then
quite
we're
get
going
it
to
any
adjust
big.
the here. And I will also just adjust the font size. Okay.
All right. We're getting closer. Oh, here,
Amazing.
Docs Google. Amazing.
Thank you all for your patience.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to minimize that screen so I can see you all. Oh my goodness. I'm just going to read the one on the screen so that we just go.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Tanu Hahtam. Chatchu. We learned in a Mishnah there, if one cut an earthenware oven widthwise into segments and place sand between each and every segment, Rabbi Elazar says that it is this thing called, whatever might be pure or tahor, whatever that might mean or not mean, ritually pure. Because of the sand, its legal status is not that of a complete vessel. Therefore, it is not susceptible to become tameh, whatever that means, ritual impurity maybe. The rabbis deem it ritually impure as it is functionally a complete oven.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second.
Please.
Purity and impurity is huge and interesting, and we're going to not talk about it at all. But for our purposes, all you need to know is that an object is only susceptible to ritual impurity if it's a completed object. And if it's like sort of in process, not finished yet, it's not. And so the debate is, does this sand keep it from being a completed object, or does it make it a completed object? Okay, keep going, Reba. Thank you.
This is known as the oven of Achnai. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of Achnai, which is a snake in this context? Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says it is characterized in that manner due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like a snake. which often forms a coil when at rest. Amazing. Surrounded it with statements like and deemed it impure. Keep going. The sages taught on that day when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations from him.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is literarily so rich, but the whole story is literarily so rich, so we're not going to stay here for long. I just want to flag, this is so far such a normal piece of Talmud. There's a rabbinic dispute about whether something is completed or incomplete and whether that makes it pure or impure. They're having an argument. So far, this is any old day in the Beit Midrash, any old day in the study hall. Everything is normal, completely normal. Okay, share over. Everyone go home. No. Okay. So this is this next section, which I've called the argument. This is the part that so many Jewish communities, especially Jewish communities that are committed to pluralism and dialogue and liberalism, love. And it is exactly as good as everyone thinks it is. And we're going to kind of blast through this part so we can get to the underrated second part. And I would love a volunteer to read this as well, which is, this is where this stops being a normal rabbinic argument about halacha, about Jewish law.
Susan, you want to go ahead?
Okay. After failing to convince the rabbi, I'm sorry if you see the broom, I'm doing something at the same time. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place, 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. The rabbis said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from the carob tree. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. The water in the stream turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. They said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from the stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the deference due to Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so Rabbi Eliezer, he's losing his argument on the merits. And so he starts bringing proofs from kind of this control of the cosmos. I am so powerful and correct that I can make this stream flow backwards. I can change the way the walls are going. And I want to point out that this doesn't seem like a Rabbi Eliezer specific power in this story, right? Because Rabbi Yehoshua responds and gets the walls to stay standing up. It seems like any rabbi could, in the framework of this story, be using these sort of natural world miraculous proofs, and they're choosing not to. So it's really a debate about the terms of the debate as well as the content. All right, Susan, keep going.
Okay. Rabbi Eliezer, I would like to note that I believe the Chicago River can be reversed.
Whoa.
But it's a long time since I knew that. Anyway, Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 12. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven, in this context? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline, Exodus chapter 23, verse 2, since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halakha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. Oh God, I love Talmud. The Gemara relates, years after, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration? Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Certainly.
Okay, this is a fantastic story. I'm talking a lot. In 1 minute, we're going to read the next section, and then I have so many questions for all of you. So the central claim here, right, is that divine signs and miracles are not how we figure out Jewish law. It happens on human terms between humans. And God is so happy about that. God is delighted by that. That is what God wants, right? Not only, so we have these sort of divine proofs, right? There's this, even up until this cosmic voice that says, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. Yes, the halacha might be like Rabbi Eliezer, but God, ultimately, we have this proof from, right, Elijah the prophet, who comes and says, I know what God was doing. God was so happy when Rabbi Yehoshua said the Torah is not in heaven. This is wonderful. God is smiling. This would also be a great end to our sugya, to our piece of Talmud. Because it seems like everything kind of went well here. There was an argument. Then there was an argument over the terms of the argument. And we've got this resolution. It seems like Rabbi Eliezer kind of lost, but God is happy. Sometimes you lose an argument. That's okay. And this is often where source sheets will stop with the story. Okay. Seems like everything is pretty good so far. Everything is about to go absolutely off the rails. This is, I think, this next piece, what I've called communal reaction. This is the piece that makes me feel like this is the right Torah for right now. And I would love someone to read just this little communal reaction piece.
Sarah,
Yeah.
And the sages said, who will go? Oh, sorry. The sages said, on that day, the sages brought all the ritually pure items deemed pure by the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the oven and burned them in fire. And the sages reached a consensus in his regard and ostracized him.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So just to be clear, this is anything that would have been ritually pure according to Rabbi Eliezer, i.e., imagine like your kitchen pot that it broke and there's like glue in between the pieces. And the Rabbi Eliezer says, that's not a real pot, so it's not impure. And the rabbis say that is a real pot, so it is impure. So anything that kind of falls under this rubric that would be pure according to Rabbi Eliezer because it's not a real object, the sages burn them and then they ostracize Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. What is going on? I want to hear, why would they do this? Right? Imagine we're living in a rabbinic world where they disagree about matters of halakha all the time. This is very par for the course in terms of the actual disagreement. And here there is this massive sort of crackdown on disagreement. What could be motivating that? Why? And there's not a right answer here. Just what's coming up in your gut based on the parts of the story we've already seen, based on your life experiences, based on other Torah you've learned, any of those sources of wisdom.
Abigail, how would you like people to answer? By hand raising or what?
Hand raising is perfect. And if you prefer not to speak out loud, you should also feel free to message me and I will read it.
And everyone now has functional permission to unmute yourself. So,
David, please.
So if you have a situation where some people think that, these pots, these dishes, these whatever are okay to eat on, and other people think not, you have a breakdown really of who can eat with whom. And you don't have a community anymore that can eat together.
So there's
And
something about this.
Yeah,
It's
there was something similar that happened in terms of Hasidim and Mitnagdim. Don't eat with them.
Yes, there's this, right? Especially if we're talking about ovens and maybe cookware, there could be this sense in which actually what seems like an attempt to shut down difference is an attempt to actually create communal cohesion. That's really interesting. Thank you. Susan.
Well, I'm wondering if the story is not so much about ritually pure items, but about Rabbi Eliezer and his relationship with the other sages. Maybe they think he talks too much. Maybe they think he has gotten a swollen head because he's a big macher in the Talmudic community. Maybe they were just looking for a way to ostracize him.
Yes. Okay. And I'm getting some messages that I'm going to read out. Thank you, Susan. So Michael says perhaps it's a reaction against Rabbi Eliezer's invocation of cosmic powers. He changed the grounds of debate from majority acceptance of reason to force. And this is backlash, right? That Rabbi Eliezer isn't going with everyone else's terms. He's trying to overpower people, and that's dangerous. Noga said something similar, which is his methods of debate are dangerous to the rabbi's communal standing. He holds populist demagogue potential. And Sarah is saying, I'm getting a sense of resentment from them, almost a softer version of Joseph's brothers. Right? Maybe they're actually mad at his connection with God. And I think we're seeing two sides of this perspective, right? That there's this sense of fear and danger in the way Rabbi Eliezer is talking, maybe about the content, but maybe about the form. And we're even getting in this Zoom room, right, two different reactions to maybe that is reasonable and defensive, and Rabbi Eliezer is headed down a dangerous path and we need to shut it down. Maybe the rabbis just resent that he has this power and they don't want to hear it. Reba and then Maurice.
I'm just feeling really moved to be studying Torah at all right now, in the context of our regard for human rights and justice in Israel Palestine, because one of the things that comes up in me when people that are saying that they are the quote unquote Jewish community, both the one that I'm close to and the ones in the big world, are speaking so much in our name in a way that doesn't feel right to what I deeply care about. One of the things that comes up in me is just like, well, then I'm not part of it and I'm not going to go, and I don't want to be Jewish and I don't want any part of it, and that's not me, and I just can't belong. And so because I can't endorse this war, and I do endorse coexistence, and so just whatever the content of what we're studying at all, I think it's touching that part of me that like is deeply present and is deeply not knowing whether it will continue to be possible for me to be part of this community. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing so vulnerably, Reba. And I think the Torah we're learning is also about how do we have Torah and community in ways that are about keeping all of us in community together and saying there is space and not having reactions that drive us apart. Even as we're disagreeing about things that are very high stakes. Okay, there are so many hands. I'm so excited that you all have so much beautiful Torah to share. And I'm going to move us along a tiny bit and hold your thoughts, and I hope we can come back to them. And I want to also flag, just when I read this story, right, there's talking about maybe there's fear of Rabbi Eliezer. I think that part of what's going on is, what are the stakes of the rabbis trying to have control over their part of the world, right? These are rabbis. Rabbi B'nai Lapeh of Sfar likes to point out that Chazal, that the sages of the Talmud, were living in a time of oppression and conquest. And there is so much fear of violence around them that it's very possible to say, of course, fear is so close to the surface. Of course, they're going to be reactive. Of course, they're going to be on edge. This feels to me almost like in the same way that I'm watching people tweet horrible things about other Jews because they support a ceasefire, that there's this sense of everything is so tenuous and we are so scared. And of course, everything needs a swift and decisive reaction when we have internal communal disagreements then, so we can maintain safety. And that feels really alive here. Okay. I would love a volunteer to read this next part, which is, I think, a really heartrending section. Maurice, I know you had your hand up earlier because you had a question, but can I impose on you to read because your hand is up?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And the sages said, who will go and inform him of his ostracism? Rabbi Akiva, his beloved disciple, said to them, I will go, lest an unseemly person go and inform him in a callous and offensive manner, and he would thereby destroy the entire world. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black and wrapped himself in black as an expression of mourning and pain, and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits, which is the distance that one must maintain from an ostracized individual. And my screen cuts off there.
Well, let's keep scrolling.
Thank you.
Much.
Do you want me to go on?
Yes, please.
Okay, so that's the distance one must maintain from an ostracized individual. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, what is different about today from other days that you comport yourself in this manner? Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. He employed euphemism as actually they distanced Rabbi Eliezer from them. Rabbi Eliezer, too, rent his garments and removed his shoes, as is the custom of an ostracized person, and he dropped from his seat and sat upon the ground.
Okay, thank you so much, Maurice. So this is a piece of Gemara that's about communication. And I think the main question implicit here is there any way to communicate about ostracism, about grief, about difference that is possibly gentle enough to overcome how hard it is? That Rabbi Akiva says, this is my beloved teacher. I'm going to go and tell him that the community is doing this to him in the most gentle way possible. But that doesn't fix it. That sometimes you can be as gentle and as thoughtful and as nuanced as you want in your communication. And that kind of doesn't soften the blow in some cases. And a question that I have for all of you is, if you had to choose, whose side in this debate do you think Rabbi Akiva is on? Do you think Rabbi Akiva really thinks that Rabbi Eliezer, his teacher, should not be ostracized? And he's trying to do some harm reduction by saying, well, at least I can tell him this in a sympathetic way. I can kind of be a bridge between these two camps where I'm feeling really torn. Or do you think Rabbi Akiva thinks that it is absolutely right for Rabbi Eliezer to be ostracized, but he is going to go about this, at least he's going to make sure it's done right? What's your instinct? And why? Sheila, please.
I think that it doesn't really matter what Rabbi Akiva thinks. I think Rabbi Akiva understands that this is happening and there's no going back. And he's trying to show respect to his teacher by informing him of it in the gentlest possible way. That, yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you. Yeah, Susan.
Well, I'm reflecting a bit on the person whose name escapes me, who talked about her struggle with belonging in the community during these trying times. And forgive me if I paraphrase incorrectly, but when I read the part or heard the part about Rabbi Akiva going in black, I immediately thought that he was mourning and grieving. And he doesn't really know how to speak to Rabbi Eliezer, who is his teacher. And it's not clear to me that he agrees with the ostracism imposed by the others, which seems to me, frankly, kind of harsh and random, given the fact that the rabbis of the Talmud engaged in discourse and disagreement all the time. So this seems to be an exception to the rule. And it strikes me that harm is being done to Rabbi Eliezer. And I go back to my original comment about the other ones maybe being jealous or whatever, or wanting to put him in his place. And I think this is very sad.
It's so sad. And part of what you're noticing is there is so much overlap in the rabbinic tradition between the practices of mourning, which I think many Jews today are familiar with, and the rabbinic processes of excommunication, which is less alive in our world, in a technical sense at least. And that there's something about this sense of, yes, you wear black, you sit on the floor. There is something about grief and loss that is overlapping with this kicking out of someone from the community. And a lot of the big question underlying that is, who's grieving and who's losing and why? And I think it's very deliberately ambiguous. Okay. I'm going to move us to this section of communal consequences. And I would love someone to read it. Jeremy, please.
The Gemara relates, his eyes shed tears, and as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, and 1/3 of its wheat, and 1/3 of its barley. And some say that even dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. The sages taught, there was great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Okay. So on an affective, emotional level, when I hear this, I'm immediately today thinking about the lack of food and water in Gaza right now, and this sense of specifically that there is this violence that is causing people to not have their material needs met. And I think a huge question about this text, which I hope can be, I don't know. But I think a big question about this text is Rabbi Eliezer doing this on purpose, and why? Is this something that Rabbi Eliezer is doing, or is it just happening in reaction to his pain, and he sort of couldn't control it even if he wanted to? And which way are you leaning, and what makes you think that? Rainer, please.
This is really, really striking because in the first place, he's been expelled from the community. In the second place, the loss of his potential to the community and his own grief is so overwhelming that it causes harm. And my sense is that he is not willing this harm. And yet, even though he's not willing it, he's being blamed for it. So it's like a double accusation that's being leveled against him.
Thank you.
And I have to say, this sounds a wee bit familiar in terms of dynamics in our community.
Yes, there's something about this anger and the destruction and blame and all of these themes feel so resonant right now. I'm getting some chats. Grace says that his gaze at self-burns makes me think that it's not on purpose. And Alan says this reaction seems to confirm the fear that Rabbi Eliezer's power is too great, whether intentional or not. Right, maybe I'm asking you all the wrong question. Does it matter what his intention is here in doing harm? Okay, Eileen and then Sarah. Eileen, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So assuming that the translation is correct, I'm picking up on a distinction between tears fell, which is almost like just a reflective reaction. It just happens because the hurt is so great, as opposed to if the text would have said he cried, which is something that the person, he would have deliberately been doing. Whether it matters in the end in terms of the consequences, I don't know, but I do see a distinction between those two things.
I agree. I think that's a sharp reading of the text. Okay, Sarah, I had called on you, and now I'm looking at the time. Will you forgive me if I move us along a little bit? You will not forgive me if I move us along. I'll live with it.
It's not a problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your generosity. So we have this tiny piece about this massive global destruction that seems like it's coming from this overflow, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And then we have this much bigger chunk of text about a one-on-one relational consequence. Can I get someone to read it? Susan, thank you. Susan, you're muted.
Okay, relational consequences. And even Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at Yavna, the head of the sages who were responsible for the decision to ostracize Rabbi Eliezer, was coming on a boat at the time. This all reminds me of Noah.
Yeah.
And a large wave swelled over him and threatened to drown him. Rabban Gamliel said, "It seems to me that this is only for the sake of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, as God punishes those who mistreat others." Rabban Gamliel stood on his feet and said, "Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that neither was it for my honor that I acted when ostracizing him, nor was it for the honor of the house of my father that I acted. Rather, it was for your honor, so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel." Oh my God. In response,
that didn't really work out.
Yeah. In response, the sea calmed from its raging. The Gemara further relates, Ima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, was the sister of Rabban Gamliel. From that incident forward, she would not allow Rabbi Eliezer to lower his head and recite the Tachanun prayer, which includes supplications and entreaties. She feared that were her husband to bemoan his fate and pray at that moment, her brother would be punished. A certain day was around the day of the new moon, and she inadvertently substituted a full 30-day month for a deficient 29-month day month. That is to say, she thought that it was the new moon when one does not lower his head in supplication, but it was not.
She got the calendar wrong and thought she could let her guard down.
Yeah. Some say that a pauper came and stood at the door and she took bread out to him. The result was that she left her husband momentarily unsupervised. When she returned, she found him and saw that he had lowered his head in prayer. She said to him, "Arise, you've already killed my brother." Is that metaphorically?
No.
Okay.
Keep going.
Meanwhile, the sound of a shofar emerged from the house of Rabbi Gamliel to announce that the Nasi had died. Rabbi Eliezer said to her, "From where did you know that your brother would die?" She said to him, "This is the tradition that I received from the house of my father. All the gates of heaven are apt to be locked, except for the gates of prayer for victims of verbal mistreatment."
Thank you so much, Susan. And this is the actual end of the story. So just to get clear on what happens, Ima Shalom is Rabbi Gamliel's sister, and she's married to Rabbi Eliezer. And Ima Shalom does not let Rabbi Eliezer do this more intense form of prayer because she knows that if he does, there will be another huge consequence, and that Rabbi Gamliel, who's ultimately responsible for his excommunication, will die. Okay, the first question I have for all of you about this piece is Rabbi Gamliel, when this wave is threatening him, and we're reminded of Noah, we're reminded of Jonah, he says, "I did this shelo yirbu machlokot b'Yisrael," so there wouldn't be more disagreements in Israel. He was trying to get to some sort of communal cohesion. And Susan, you remarked on this even as you read it. That is the opposite of what happens. This attempt at communal cohesion only leads to massive destruction. However, the sea does calm. What do you all make of that? Like, do you think that God hears that and is like, that's a good point? Do you think something else? Well, I think that there's something here about this tension between whether or not intention matters or doesn't matter, which I think is a huge theme here, is if you have the best of intentions, but you end up causing harm, does that matter? And that question, I think, can apply to so many different things going on right now in terms of political activism people are doing, in terms of other kinds of speech that are fomenting violence. All of these things, does intent matter? And I think this Gemara doesn't know the answer. I think this sugya is really confused. And I think that can be really helpful, that it can say, we can be trying our best to protect the Jewish people, to take care of the whole world. And sometimes we can misfire. Sometimes we get it wrong. And that is something that there can be space for, but that doesn't necessarily undo the harm. Noga is writing in the chat, the sea rolled not because of God, but because of Rabbi Eliezer's hurt and anger. When Rabban Gamliel shared his intentions and values, the hurt is still there, but the emotional reactive waves are calmed. Right? Maybe there's something about this is all reactions to emotional pain. And that when we can have communication, that can help us undo some of that. And something else that I want to call our attention to is Ima Shalom as this character who was really pulled in between the kind of two teams, as it were, in this story, and demonstrates that there aren't really two teams. She is hurt on all sides. We're talking about her husband has been ostracized by her brother. She is not as much a power player, right? She's not the head of the Sanhedrin. She's not a rabbi calling down on God to speak for her. And she is trying her best to hold everything together. And she's not trying to make any giant moral claims. She's just trying to keep people alive. And on that note, I want us to look at this excerpt from Rebecca Epstein-Levy about what is happening in this story in terms of what is Torah learning and how does it create and shape our relationships to each other in the world. This is a fantastic book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. A lot of it is about sexual ethics. I've pulled a part that isn't about sexual ethics because it's not as relevant for our subject, but it's fantastic and I would highly recommend it. And I would love a volunteer to read it. And this is I would say for an academic text, relatively clear, but it is still an academic text. So we're going to read it. And if you don't understand all of it, that is just fine because we're going to get clear on what it means together after we read it. Sheila, please.
The cosmic response to rabbinic edge play gone out of control in this story is rather extreme even by Talmudic standards. Yet the story aptly demonstrates several features of the series of risks and rewards inherent to the rabbis' communal interpretive practices. The potential for social fracturing and personal loss of social standing among an already small and marginalized community highlights the high stakes of that community's valuation of pitched, intense, and often vicious disputation as the central affinity-generating, identity-forming activity upon which it is built. The risk is heightened by the subject matter of this disputation play. The story reminds us that the rabbis are fighting over the words of God, which are powerful and volatile things in their own right. As such, this play has potential physical, social, and metaphysical consequences. And Rabbi Eliezer's exasperated invocation of direct divine power adds yet another level of cosmic danger to the play. All the same, the discourse is clearly well aware of its multiply risky character. Indeed, the inclusion of this extreme story, especially coming as it does in the context of a longer discussion about the harms of verbal wronging and humiliation, may be read itself as a risk management practice. Interpersonal virtues, including virtues of careful speech and preserving the dignity of one's peers, are important, the Gemara seems to say. This is doubly true for the risky communal practices of interpretation and disputation of sacred texts that define the sagely self and form the rabbinic community, and so there are best practices for this kind of discourse. And in case you doubted the importance of scrupulous attention to and cultivation of these best practices, the Gemara adds, let us demonstrate for you the full stakes of the game you are playing. Now perhaps you understand why such care might be called for.
Thank you
Should
so
I keep
much.
going?
No, we're gonna pause here. Thank you. Okay. So Dr. Epstein-Levy is telling us that dispute over Torah and argument, it is central, it is affinity generating, it is identity forming, and it is so profoundly risky. These conversations are essential. People are creating entire worlds and communities around it. And people can literally die because of it in this story. And that holding at the same time, both that this is so, so risky, so fraught, the stakes are so high and so dangerous, does not mean that it is not essential to do it. Rather, we need to do it carefully and with attention to each other's needs and each other's humanity. And that to me seems like a really resonant reading of this story for this moment, in thinking about there is so much death and destruction and grief, and it is so tempting to think that what's going to prevent machlokot b'Yisrael is an attempt to be uniform, an attempt to get to the sameness. And I think this story takes a look at that attempt and says, that is doomed, that cannot work. That is actually stifling what is most essential about the project of Torah, about the project of building a just world. And that is only going to lead to more destruction and more outcry. And I want to close with a different take on this story from Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Belser, who's a Jewish feminist theologian who focuses on queerness and disability. And this is from her 2018 book about stories about the destruction of the temple. And in her conclusion to this book, she kind of unexpectedly starts talking about our story, about Tanur Shel Achnai. And this is the image that I want to leave us with. So I would love someone to read it. Jessica, thank you.
Sorry, I had to get unmuted. In this tale, Rabbi Eliezer's grief is not his alone. His pain ricochets out through the world, shattering the harvest, brutalizing the land. The wheat, the olives, and the barley crop are disseminated. Rabbi Eliezer casts fire wherever he looks. As the rabbi weeps, the world goes up in flames. How shall we read this tale? We might, of course, take this story as a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of violent speech, a reminder that shame can shatter a life, destroy a world. But to read the tale only as a rebuke against the rabbis who humiliate another sage silences an important dimension of the story, the way it portrays God as profoundly responsive to human pain. Bavli Baba Metzia, 59b, concludes our story with the words of Ima Shalom: all the gates are locked except for the gates of wronging. Though the divine gates are often shut before prayer, the tears of the wronged have a unique capacity to stir divine action. Eliezer's pain evokes a powerful response from God. It is not a particularly compassionate response, nor a measured one. Shame prompts divine violence. It causes social convulsion. God's response to Rabbi Eliezer's shame brings tremendous destruction to the world, a destruction that far outstrips the scope and scale of the inciting incident. Is this divine punishment? Perhaps. But I would argue that the frame of punishment is too thin a prism to capture the texture of God's feeling. Divine responsivity seems to better account for the dynamics of destruction in this tale. Bavli Baba Metzia's God is a God who cannot countenance Rabbi Eliezer's tears, who is overwhelmed by his grief, who feels his suffering so intensely that the divine response engulfs the entire world. This is a God whose empathy comes utterly unbound, a God whose feeling shatters the earth in the wake of one man's pain.
Thank you so much for reading that, Jessica. So that's the understanding of this story that I want to close with, that this is ultimately a story about God who cannot handle human suffering. And that when someone is in pain, this is a God who is in pain with them, so much so that it is unbearable and overflowing. And that's an image of God that I want us to all hold, moving out of this Torah space and into the other spaces of Torah in the world. And thank you for learning Torah with me. I hope this was nourishing, and I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Avigayil.
Thank you. Great.
Truly deep Torah and beautifully facilitated.
Thank you.
So I want to thank Rabbi Avigayil Halpern for being our teacher today, as well as the Truah staff who made this session possible. That includes Victoria Cano, Shira Danan, Rabbi Becky J, Rabbi Jenna Shah, and Maddie Spector. We'd love to hear your feedback on this program. So in a moment, I'm dropping a link in the chat to a feedback form. It'll take you 60 seconds to fill out. We'd be grateful, especially to know what went well, what didn't go well, and if we should continue more conversations like this in coming weeks with other teachers of Torah. And finally, I want to thank you all for coming here today in this difficult time. My blessing for us is that we can dwell in humility and honor the leaders in our lives who can admit when they don't know the best course of action. Take care of yourselves and the people you love. Have a good day.